Okay. Next chapter in the Impressionist, titled Correspondence. Justine had just gotten home from work, and her dog had greeted her with its usual vociferous welcome. Her dog, Achilles, had vaguely taken the form of a German shepherd during its year-long growth from a yet-to-be housebroken pup into its mature size, weighing in at just under 90 pounds. Achilles' body was enveloped in a coat of short black fur with a spangle of white down his chest. The dog's testicles had remained intact, Justine having decided to promote the dog's fullest possible growth by merely refusing to have the little helpless creature castrated. Achilles' head jerked up, then he quickly rose upon his legs and trotted down the porch steps to greet the woman who kept him fed and kept him happy with the strokes of her hand across his backside and the rubbing of his ears when he could smell the wondrous aroma rising from her skin. Justine had paused at the county road's edge to retrieve her mail from the mailbox, which stood upon a piece of sculptured iron, 3 thick intertwisting iron rods this an amateur blacksmith had made and had been selling at a craft show one day in early June a few years ago. Justine bought hers at this community event, which included a plate on the top with a set of 6 holes drilled through it, with which to secure the mailbox itself with the nuts, washers, and bolts. Justine had built her own mailbox out of wood, made it to appear like a cabin in the woods with an alpine roof at a 45-degree pitch. Among her mail was a day-old copy of the New York Times, yet another nuisance card from the Neptune Society, a supermarket 4-page tabloid featuring all the week's great deals in the deli, the bakery, and the butcher shop, plus all the lavish discounts on beer, wine, and assorted spirits. She also had a letter from Bernie. She dumped a cup and a half of kibbles into Achilles' stainless steel food bowl, and this daily offering was consumed in just under 2 minutes. When the dog belched after the bowl was empty, Justine glanced at him with a mock look of annoyance and said, "Achilles, you should be ashamed of yourself. When are you ever going to learn not to belch?" Achilles gave her his usual quizzical look whenever her strange, quiet bark came into his ears. He cocked his head slightly to one side to see if she would command him to do something like sit or lay down. When she failed to do either one, he chose to lay down on the warm rug right under the table, where Justine sometimes slipped her feet out from her rabbit fur-lined slippers when Achilles could smell her bare feet in full measure. With the dog at her feet, she opened Bernie's letter and began to read. Dear Justine, as you know, my parents' death had come as an extreme shock to me. The Washington State Patrol called my number to inform me of the accident they had been in and their subsequent passing away, not even an hour later after they were taken to the nearest hospital, which was in Everett. I had been asleep when the Washington State Patrol notified me. At first I wasn't able to grasp why they had even bothered to contact me. When this woman's deadpan voice explained that among my father's and mother's possessions found at the scene of the accident were two identical cards stating that a Bernard Youngers was to be contacted in case of a serious emergency. But then in only a few hours I would have to drive across town to get to work and begin my 8-hour grind. I called in and left a message with an obscure hint and an excuse that a terrible car accident had occurred to members of my immediate family, and so I would need a week off of bereavement time. And that was nearly the complete message. What else did I need to say? But that wasn't how my boss looked at it, the heartless bastard. Later he told me during an awkward and finally heated exchange that according to company policy he was on solid ground to terminate my position since I had not made the usual and expected formal request for the time off in writing. At that point my resentment toward the company I'd once worked for was profound. I had fantasies of entering the building after clobbering the security guard over the head with the butt end of a 9mm handgun, after which I would take the elevator to the 19th floor, walk into their corporate offices, and begin shooting and killing everyone there who wasn't the secretary and didn't work in the mailroom. But losing my job was hardly the financial catastrophe I had first thought it would have been. What did I lose was, what I did lose was the woman I'd been seeing for nearly a year. She said she couldn't handle my depression, that she felt no pleasure in being around me anymore, that I'd turned into a kind of ghost who barely said a word. And I suppose that was close to the mark. As time passed, I came to forgive her, although I'd never said this directly to her since she'd asked me not to call her anymore, that our relationship was over and there'd be no point in us talking. So, observing her wish, I continued to remind myself of what a faithless and shallow cunt she had been. All that was years ago. Her presence in my life now next to non-existent, since I rarely recall her any longer. Years ago, all this happened. Years ago. Afraid I got this letter off to a rather gloomy start, Justine. Although as Halloween draws closer and closer, I would think a bit of gloom is not uncalled for, nor inappropriate. I doubt you ever received many trick-or-treaters out your way, so off the beaten path as you are. Well, I had a good time finally, only a couple of nights ago. Quite unexpected it was. For a change, I'd finally opened myself up to a bit of adventure again. And a pleasant and enjoyable evening occurred like, as you might say, a gift from the gods. Those same gods who spin the wheels and mechanisms of fate. Always with affection, Bernie. Justine rose from the table where she'd been reading the letter from her deceased lover's son. "Bernie, Bernie, Bernie," she said aloud, just above a whisper. She had shared in his grief, though certainly in a way which had been much different. At the time, she had found it almost impossible to imagine the sense of loss he was undergoing, and would continue to undergo for several more months. She had his phone number, and she would call him once every 2 weeks or so, and doing so had done much to create the relationship she had and enjoyed with him now. In their shared grief, they had bonded, not unlike might a mother and son. And that is perhaps close to what she began to feel for him, not to mention the fact that Bernie looked very much like his father, so like Leo. During that time immediately following the accident, Justine had begun to dream about making love to Leo. But after whatever amounts to time slipping by in a dream, Leo's face would suddenly transform itself into that of Bernie's. And of course this dream she kept to herself. She certainly never told Bernie about it. Bernie and Sheila were eating dinner. Sheila had prepared for the two of them a Greek salad, beef stroganoff. Along with their meal, they now and again tipped back a glass of the Bordeaux which Bernie had brought along. He was thinking, Sheila doesn't like to talk. She can be very amusing sometimes. On the heels of this thought, he said, "A while ago you mentioned more or less in passing that you'd gone to the UW after you got out of high school. What did you study?" "Oh, Bernie, like most of us when we were only 18, I didn't have the slightest clue as to what I wanted to do. I wound up majoring in pre-law. What about you?" "Well, being as clueless as everyone else at that age, all I knew was what I absolutely did not want to go into, and that was teaching. Both of my parents had been professors over there in Bellingham. Their lives simply seemed sedentary and boring to me. I wanted a career with more excitement, you see, something that would offer a far greater range of possibilities. I've had plenty of boring, monotonous jobs, Bernie, sitting on my ass all day," she was said. "They're hard to avoid." "Well, no doubt my biggest and boldest ambition was to become a film director. But how does one go about that? Actually doing that?" And then I glommed on to the notion of becoming a doctor. "I knew it," she said with satisfaction. "Deep down you're the romantic dreamer type, which happens to be one of my favorites. What about the scientific-minded, nerd-wearing glasses type?" Not so much. But as I've gotten older, I've become less choosy," she said. "But it's funny you mentioned that you considered, no matter how briefly or disingenuously, that you might have wanted to go into show business. Who on this planet wouldn't think, when they were only 18, that going into show business would be glamorous? Just about no one would, I'd say. Once I toyed with the idea of going into dance and become a choreographer. But who was I kidding? Sheila Sarakovsky, thrusting herself through complicated patterns of movement across the dance floor. You'd have to be joking. I'm built like my mother, and from a distance on a cold winter day, you couldn't tell her apart from a Russian peasant woman. You're sort of like Jack in one respect," he said, smiling. "You're both self-deprecating." "Yeah, I suppose you're right. Maybe that's why the two of us get along so well." Later in bed, they made love to each other with ease and delight. Bernie left Sheila's apartment early the following morning, walked back up the stairs to his own place where he took a shower, shaved, then put on a fresh pair of socks, boxer shorts, and a shirt, as well as a different tie, after which he drove to work. The Seattle Arts Commission, upon a unanimous decision on the part of a 5-member board of directors, had elected to move their numerous offices and employees to a different location, somewhat larger with a far more palatable lease arrangement than the previous one. This move nearly 4 years prior to Bernie's arrival there. This new location had been considered by a small and extremely vocal and opinionated minority to be just one more instance among a whole insidious web of instances of what had come to be called creeping socialism. That 3 of the 5 board members were registered Republicans seemed to have mattered little to a particularly vociferous group who called themselves the high-minded sounding Commission to Enhance Decency in Education and the Arts, CEDEA for short. To counter CEDEA's bald-faced propaganda with its ominous undercurrent of a systematic and cynical and however gradual plan of elimination of individual and civil rights, progressive and democratic socialists buried the hatchet and formed in a joint and coordinated fashion effort an opposition lobbying group known as the Premier Unionist Colloquium for Knowledge, Understanding, and Reform, or PUCKER, as it quickly came to be known. Over a period of only a single year, there arose an ever more heated public exchange between these two groups, which culminated in personal attacks so outrageous and repellent, not to mention illegal, since some of these public utterances appearing on various internet platforms clearly constituted threats of bodily harm or even death, that the FBI was obviously compelled to step in, and they mounted a thoroughgoing investigation which, your present author had hoped at the time, turned out to be similar to a matter for which this agency had once been highly regarded, even beyond reproach, as the strong third arm of justice back when J. Edgar Hoover ran the bureau like a czar. One of the more outrageous members of Pucker's public relations team became widely known in his semi-anonymous public persona as the Mad Magician along Monroe Street, or simply put, MMMS, who gradually became notorious for his satirical vilifications of the right-wing so-called moralists, underpinned as they were and still remain by the evangelical movement and their almost continuous presence in this author's view, quite peculiar to the United States, owing to our country's never-ending obsession with religion and guns, for that matter. A Seattle-based political cartoonist even got into the act. Bernie had first read about these localized culture wars on what grew from a weekly to a daily basis, amply covered by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, the cartoonist's employer. Most readers of the paper did not know that this person happened to be a woman who submitted her work under a pen name, a pseudonym. She happened to also be the mother of 3 teenage children, 2 boys and a girl. Her pen name was Samuel R. Winthrop. Bernie had actually met this lady once. He even had drinks with her, and further along this not infrequently recalled night, having gradually charmed one another into unspoken thoughts of getting a hotel room for further amusements, Bernie thought better of it toward the end of their evening and declined her hint at such an invitation with a quickly fabricated excuse, saying that recently he'd come to consider a religious conversion to the Muslim faith. And because Alice Baker was black, she gave him a pass, although she still suspected him of lying, the impotent coward. While eating a Reuben sandwich for lunch at a cafe in Missoula, Jack got a call from T-Bone Jefferson. "Hey, Bayfield, how are you doing, my man?" "Oh, good to hear from you, T-Bone," Jack replied with anxious surprise. "Well, I got one more night here in Missoula, then it's on down the line to Butte, where I have to hang out there for a single Wednesday night appearance. And then I hit the road again for a 2-night run in Pocatello, but I sent you an email with my schedule. You saw it, didn't you?" "Yeah, man, I saw it," T-Bone said. "Now listen up, Jackson, because I got you a gig at Sun Valley, buddy. You need to get your ass over there right after you finish up in Boise. Got a slot for you in Ketchum, man. You'll be a warm-up act for whatever big-shot joker they got lined up there. This is the sort of exposure you want, they feel. You'd be surprised at the number of big names in Hollywood who have second homes there in Ketchum. Idaho's Hollywood. Enclave, my friend." Jack thanked him and then said, "I'm lucky to have you for an agent now, T-Bone." "Fucking A, you got that right. Another call coming in, man. I gotta go." Later that same afternoon, Jack boarded the bus traveling from Missoula to Butte. He stayed in one of Butte's remaining old-fashioned hotels downtown, within just a few blocks of the bar, which hosted a comedy show each Wednesday night, reserving Thursday, Friday, and Saturday nights for the foot-stomping music provided by some regional country and western band. During the short remainder of the afternoon, Jack stayed in his hotel room and practiced his impersonations. His repertoire of various voices included several ersatz accents: Mexican, Irish, the Bronx, upper-class British, and Russian. He could still not render his French accent with complete and proper confidence, and therefore none of the material he wrote had so far called for mimicking an individual from France. But he kept working at it until he would pause in disgust and discouragement and move on to the ones he had already more or less mastered. His performance in Butte went well enough in a routine way. The following morning he was out of bed early in order to catch the southbound bus to Pocatello. And there in Pocatello, a woman named Estella Ochoa awaited him. Jack and Estella had known each other for a bit less than 3 years. He always stayed at her apartment when he was in town. The two of them were always glad to see each other again. She was often amused by his unexpected remarks, and she loved him for his sense of dark humor and his effulgent imagination. She sometimes thought of him as spontaneous and childlike. He was always coming up with new ideas. One of his recently devised routines involved a besieged customer service agent and a string of increasingly nasty and outraged subscribers to a satellite TV service. And this is what Estella did all day long to earn a living.